Good afternoon. My name is Ana Franco. I'm president of the Association for Latin American Art. We're really thrilled to have you all here, and we thank you for joining us in the first event of ALA's Summer Book Launch Series. For ALA, it's really a pleasure to support our members in the promotion of their research. So we're very happy that today we're here launching the newly published collection, Collective Creativity and Artistic Agency in Colonial Latin America, which was edited by Maya Stanfield-Mazzi and Margarita Vargas Betancourt. We will be hearing from authors and contributors who will be dialoguing about topics and issues discussed in the book. We want to thank the University of Florida Press for partnering with us in this event, and also we thank them for the generous discount for our members. For today, you can use the code LASA23 and receive a 50% discount. So make sure you make the most of it. Finally, I would like to invite other ALA members to submit their new publications for following events throughout this summer. Leslie Wolf, our VP, has been sending emails with information, and I believe she will be posting in the chat very soon. And well, now I'll just turn to Romy Gutierrez from UFP, who will introduce the book and the editors. Many thanks for being here, and enjoy.
Thank you, Ana. The University of Florida Press is an imprint of the statewide University Press of Florida, the publishing arm of the state university system founded in 1945. The University of Florida Press imprint was established to publish works of high caliber that reflect the research strengths of the University of Florida. Among other subjects, this imprint publishes books on Latin American art, culture, history, and geography. We are so very proud to be the publisher of Collective Creativity and Artistic Agency in Colonial Latin America, edited by Maya Stanfield-Mazzi, professor of art history at the University of Florida, and Margarita Vargas Betancourt, the Latin American and Caribbean Special Collections librarian at the George A. Smathers Libraries of the University of Florida. The book follows the decolonial call in challenging us to rethink how we conceptualize the figure of the artist by arguing for an approach to artistic study that is more reflective of the social circumstances of colonial Latin America. This volume broadens the ways that creativity can be understood and renders previously marginalized artists highly visible. As Ana said, you can purchase the book at a discounted price on the link that is in the chat. And with that, thank you very much for attending, and I will turn it over to the volume editors.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on a summer afternoon, on a Friday even. And a special thanks to ALA for suggesting this event and for offering to inaugurate their book launch series with our book. I'm thrilled to be here with my co-editor, Margarita Vargas Betancourt, to begin a discussion about the different chapters of the book and the critical questions that arise from them. So as Romy said, thank you well, first of all, it's been such a great experience to work with the University of Florida Press, especially editor Stephanie Hunter, who couldn't be here today, but Romy is in her stead. We really had a wonderful experience and came out with a book that, well, you're not seeing it in person, but I was really thrilled with the quality of the book. It's in hardback and paperback with all color images and excellent paper quality. So just a great experience, and we thank UPF for that. The book came out of an idea of wanting to look at artists in colonial Latin America through different lenses, to understand how artists functioned, acted, and really were professional intellectuals in Latin American society within the colonial limitations that they faced. So all of our authors look at artists in various ways, and we see artists as activists, artists as agents in commerce. We see artists as experts in society. We see artists as revolutionaries. So it really widens the scope of activities that we can understand people doing as artists also. And certainly we get into the terms by which they were described, the professional terms in that time period. And really, looking at artists in a way that we think goes beyond the traditional biographical approach which is of course a standard of art history. You'll see how that works when we hear from the different authors. Wanted to mention first that the conception of this project was really came out of an inspiration in the work of Susan Verdi Webster. And so we dedicated the volume to her on the occasion of her retirement from College of William and Mary. Susan's work, her extensive archival work in Quito, Ecuador, and the way that she found unknown artists and really elevated them and showed the multiple ways and the multifaceted ways in which they worked in society and also gained professional recognition. That really inspired us to try to look to other areas for that. And Emily Floyd, one of our authors, also builds on that on Susan's work from Ecuador. We also were really privileged to be able to include the chapter by the late Linda Marie Rodriguez, who contributes our only chapter on the Caribbean, her chapter on artists in late 18th century Cuba. Our other author, Ananda Cohen, suggested that we could possibly include her essay, Linda's essay, which was had unpublished at the time, and she contacted Linda's heirs, and we were able to gain permission and edit that essay and get also new photographs of the murals, which you'll see a few of up ahead. So we're really honored to be able to include Linda Rodriguez's chapter. And Paul Neal is here to say some words about Linda's chapter up ahead. Some practical things about the volume, if you're thinking of maybe using it for a class in the upcoming years. It has, I think 9 chapters, including amongst that an introduction and conclusion. As I said, the illustrations are all in color. One choice that we did make in the process was to include individual bibliographies and footnotes attached to each chapter, so you can use them individually. And the press supported us in that decision, which was great. And I'll tell you what we have planned for today. So each author, we have a few authors who aren't here, so we're going to speak for them, but each author will briefly present the highlights and the main topic of their essay and answer a question that's been posed to them about it. And then they will pose a question to the next author, and we will have a sort of roundtable that way. After we finish with that, we'll open it up to the audience for questions, which you can answer through the Q&A, not through the chat. See if there's anything else before we get started. I think that is all. So we'll begin. Oh, I was going to say we are going in backwards order from the order of the book. We're starting with the conclusion of the book, which was co-written by Barbara Mundy and Aaron Hyman. So we have Barbara Mundy here to speak to that and to speak broadly to the critical stakes of the book. And then we'll hear from Paul Neal about Linda Rodriguez's chapter, which is late 18th century, as I said. So we'll go kind of backwards in time to try to make this more dynamic. And so you'll have a variety of people to hear from. So let me turn first to Barbara Mundy and thank her for being here.
Thank you, Maya. It's really a pleasure to be with so many of you and so many old friends on in this book. And I send my regrets from Aaron Hyman, who's in Europe and in an impossible time zone. He's sorry that he can't be joining us as well. The book, writing the conclusion for the book was in some ways both easy and hard. it was easy because there were so many rich essays to draw on and think about. In particular, the essays as a whole brought to the fore the work of artists, often subaltern artists, whose work has generally not been part of the kind of larger canon of Latin American art. In doing so, the bringing to the fore artists who have been neglected in the past, it really, the authors, I think, did two things. Number one, they looked at traditional artistic activity like painting, and I'm thinking of Jen Saraceno's chapter. But they also brought to the fore other roles that artists would play. Maya has a lovely chapter where she's thinking about the artists as members of guilds, particularly Indigenous artists. So what was a real challenge that the book sets out is that I think in order to present a capacious view of who artists are, we also have to widen our notion of what constitutes artistic activity. So in the book, when you read it, you'll meet not only painters, but you'll also meet merchants, guild members, and you'll get a look, I think, at the really nitty-gritty of the artists' economies and the art worlds that they lived in, particularly their kind of economic situations. So that was a really wonderful and valuable part of this book. And I think many of the authors really also followed the lead of Susan Verity Webster, whose lifelong commitment and work in the Quito archives has produced, as Mayan said, a really rich picture of artistic activity in Quito. But that also raises a challenge, I think, for all of us as art historians, because the archive can sometimes give us artists, but it often doesn't give us artists. And one of the larger questions, I think, going forward to all of us who are committed to write new art histories that look at the production of people who've been marginalized in the past, is the struggle of what to do when the archive doesn't give us what we want. And I think that that's a really an open question for all of the writers here to think hard about what archives we use and what creative approaches we might adopt when we can't find the artists in the archives. In part, the archive itself is an inhospitable place for the artists we like to write about. Their works were not prioritized in the past, and many people and many in many moments their works were not seen as worthy of kind of collecting or archiving. So the works in the chapters in this book really make a huge contribution to kind of shedding light on new areas of artistic activity. But they also, I think, lead us to think about what do we do when the archives don't tell us enough. I want to turn to, Maya asked me to ask a question, and I'm happy to also to answer questions at the end of this. Maya asked me to ask a question of Paul, who will be talking about Linda Rodriguez's work. And that chapter in the book is a really marvelous reading of a single court case. And in it, Linda uses that court case to capture broader phenomena of the Cuban art world. In the case that she homes in on, a free man of color, whose name is Pedro Dionisio Muñoz de Caballo, he was charged in Havana in 1791 of selling potentially lethal pigments. Now, this probably never would have resulted in criminal charges, but it seems to have emerged when white Creole hegemony was under grave threat. Bear in mind that the Haitian Revolution erupted just in August of 1791, so literally around the same time. Linda's reading of this criminal case of a pigment seller, he's not an artist, he's a pigment seller, nonetheless allows the reader to glimpse an entire art world that I think was unseen before Linda did this work. It's a multiracial world of merchants, painters, and patrons, where many of the Afro-Cuban participants could be either enslaved or free. So it's a wonderful picture of a rich art world, and it really is a great cross-section of all of the people participating in it. I wanted to turn to Paul because Linda's argument really dovetails nicely with your own work on the 19th century, where you've argued, particularly for Cuba, that aesthetic discourses, particularly those discourses of buen gusto, which you write so nicely about, those were a means of reasserting social power of white Cubans, essentially to promote a racist agenda. Could you talk a little bit about, because I'm not an 18th century person, so this is outside my ken, but could you address how Linda's work, which with its focus on Havana, changes or challenges our conventional narratives about 18th century Latin American art history more broadly?
Thank you. Yeah, let me just thank Maya and Margarita for the invitation. It's great to be here, and congratulations on this book. It turned out so well, as Maya was saying. And thanks, Barbara, for the question. I think I will go, because you did summarize a bit of what the book, what the chapter is about, and I'll come back around to that. But just to go straight to your question in terms of, how Linda's work changes, challenges, and so on, our conventional narratives about the 18th century. One thing that stood out to me very much about this chapter is it challenges us to think about the potential of the judicial archive, right? This is a document. The document in question comes from the Audiencia de Santo Domingo, which is the High Court of the Andes in the Caribbean, and it isn't labeled as such that you would think that it had to do with art production. It mentions the racial standing of the individual as a pardo, and then the corrosive effects of something. And it's always made me wonder, how this document caught Linda's attention, because she and I used to talk about the lack of documentation for guilds in colonial Havana. And I know this was an area of her research that she was pressing on. And it's an extensive court record. It's 226 pages, out of which comes this kind of extraordinary insight that, first of all, verifies the existence of guilds in Havana, because we have, this court case in which witnesses are being brought on behalf of the defense, witnesses are being brought on behalf of the prosecution, and there are accusations going back and forth. And out of that, we see clearly that there was an internal organization amongst these artists that seemed to be well established by the 1790s. And that was something that, the archive in Havana was very resistant to giving up. And so the court case kind of bears it out. It gives us so much to think about in terms of the intersection between art and race, right? So I think that it's really a call to take the judicial record seriously, for all that it can show us. Which of course raises questions about how do we look for this insight? How do we search the judicial record? But it just seems to be like another field in which this kind of research can be done. Another aspect of this chapter, Barbara, to your question is how some of the artists in question petitioned to not be affiliated with the guilds in 1770. And rather to be considered professors of the arts of painting. And Linda actually draws this out of another source from the ANC, the archive. And this insight of their petitioning to be separated from those other artists really resonates so strongly with what Susan Dean Smith has found in the context of Mexico City, amongst Miguel Cabrera and a host of artists there. And speaks to, I think, really our need to consider a broader transatlantic conversation about, the liberal arts of painting in this time, you know, about academies and the notion of being a director or a professor of painting, and how artists are leveraging this concept within a racialized society. I mean, as Dean Smith's case is about artists calling for separation, you know, because they do not want to be associated with artists of mixed race, of indigenous or African descent. And that's, you know, that's a very different kind of situation than what Linda's writing about in terms of racial subject positions. But it's a similar kind of call, right? So it speaks to how like situated these actions are. I mean, how artists are negotiating different kinds of environments, but in some cases are doing so through these notions of institutionalized art, is really pretty stunning. And I think that turning to the murals, Leslie, if you wanted to cue those, these extraordinary images, which come from mostly late 18th century architectural contexts in Havana, including private houses, churches, city council buildings. And the evidence is pretty overwhelming that the majority of the painters were people of African descent. And this is Sybil Fisher years ago called these popular painters, after the record, after some language that's used in the record. And then Linda brings in a case by a Protestant minister who's traveling through Cuba in the 1820s, and he describes these in lucid detail and talks about how the artists are all African descendant people. It appears at that time there's a taste that's sort of declining for these, in part because of the labor pool that the artists are being drawn from. So finally, you know, thinking about, again, what does this do to our larger perception of the 18th century, this chapter by Linda? I mean, it kind of speaks to moments of transition and flux in the economic base, when, as you mentioned, you know, Cuba is shifting to a plantation economy from a kind of a service colony to an export-oriented plantation economy, overwhelmingly dependent on slavery. A really violent shift like that in the economic base has this effect on the social and cultural superstructure on top of it. I mean, particularly in this age of reform, where we do get into these issues of buen gusto and good taste. And as we discussed years ago in our volume, that taste is more than just an artistic reference. It's like a subjectivity. It's a worldview. And, you know, as these economic factors are shifting, as Linda makes this very compelling case that the vitality of the commercial base is manifested in the artistic exuberance of the moment. So she says that Black labor had to be removed from the artistic realm in order for the 19th century aesthetic agenda to be fulfilled. So it challenges us to think about and consider the shifts in the economy and how they impact class struggle, and how, you know, that is often racial struggle in the Ibero-Americas, and then how that relates to art production. It's really, I mean, the irony of this is interesting, because if these paints are poisonous, then these artists are really enveloping their patrons in poison, but it's not the kind of poison that they actually fear. But anyway, I mean, this chapter, like Linda's dissertation, has this really amazing way to go into the archive and use documentation to, to use it innovatively and creatively to draw out all of these interesting intersections between art, race, and society. So I believe I was supposed to pose a question for Nandi, but she can't be here. So Maya, is there
Yes, Paul, yeah, Nandi, unfortunately, something came up, so she couldn't be here with us. But I was going to present briefly on her chapter. So if you want, you can pose a question, and I'll see if I can answer it, at least from my perspective.
Okay. The chapter, Nandi's chapter, really turns our attention to iconoclasm in the Andes in the era of the late 18th century, insurgencies. And she notes that there's been, a disproportionate attention to museum quality artworks that will not allow us to see the alternative visualities that must be appreciated to better understand, as she says, anti-colonial insurgent visual cultures during the late 18th century and throughout the colonial period, perhaps, right? So she calls for us to consider lost images, right, in the agencies of this kind of context where we find, quote, artists with no known artworks through a lateral approach to the historic archive rather than a teleological one. So I was going to ask, does she suggest that this kind of approach might be more appropriate to images in an iconoclastic moment, such as these revolutionary actions? Or is it broader than that as a methodology, given the sheer number of colonial images that have been lost in a host of contexts? So can this lateral approach be taken, into non-revolutionary moments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Paul. So Nandi's chapter looks at various types of artworks and definitely expands out the role of the artist, even looking at artists as looking at people who do iconoclastic acts or engage in different ways in the political moments of the late 18th century, especially the Tupac Amaru rebellion of the 1780s, as kind of acting on the material world, and in those ways points to kind of their manipulation of artworks, either whether it's painting over works, whether it's defacing portraits, royal portraits especially, and then as well as artists who were creators. But definitely it's a fraught moment in which in the aftermath of the rebellion, the colonial Spanish officials really outlawed and ordered the destruction of visual materials that had supported the rebellion. So it definitely was a unique moment, and unique especially in the fact that it generated such a large written archive, which Nandi has also very, very carefully consulting and looking at in different ways. So I do think, as to your question, Paul, it's gets at a particular moment, and so her method is useful there. But it does seem to me like it could be used for earlier periods, say maybe the contact period, or in other which maybe similarly has a large written archive and has been looked at in certain ways, and now we can take a more of a decolonial lens to that and think about artworks that just do not survive today, and kind of be imaginary about them, and instead think about their creators who are documented in the archive. One artist that Nandi talks about quite a bit is Antonio Oblitas, who was an assistant, an Afro-Indigenous assistant to Tupac Amaru, the rebel leader, and who painted his portrait. Now that portrait does not survive, but she is able to really, bring his name into now our art history of the 18th century Andes, and use related works or works created later. And some of the works that we see here are related to that. Can we have the next slide? Also, innovative research that has come out with analysis of paintings having various lives and moments in which they made certain statements and then were altered, repainted to make, in this case, mainly rebel statements, but also sometimes royalist, show royalist allegiances. So there's been some important technical analyses, especially done by the Mali Museum in Lima, that have led to some of the paintings that Nandi discusses. So certainly a rich moment for study, and one that's well documented, better documented in some ways than others, but then less of a visual record. But I do think that her approach could be applied in other ways, in other periods, better said. So since unfortunately Nandi's not with us, I'm going to move on to the next chapter, the chapter that comes before that, which is by Emily Floyd. And Margarita is going to introduce us briefly to that chapter. And we're going to answer the question that Nandi did pose a question for Emily, which we can, which Margarita, maybe you can read and we can answer together.
I'm so sorry that Emily just left, but she had to go. I mean, it was nice to see her baby, and it was very nice to have her contribution here. So Emily wrote this article based on a book here at my library. Can you please go to the next slide? The book, and you know, here at UF, I'm the archivist librarian. This book was online in the University of Florida Digital Collections, and I think that's Emily's first point of access, UFDC. Then she corresponded with me and asked to see the physical copy when she was going to be here for the HESCA symposium that gave way to this book. And what she does is she analyzes like she questions this idea of originality of indigenous images, indigenous paintings, to propose like a new way of seeing art in Latin America. And she studies this engraving in the UF book, Corona of the Divinísima Virgen María. And she tells the story of how this plate obscures the story and the existence of an indigenous painter and an engraver whose ethnicity we don't really know, although we suspect he might be either Criollo or European. And the way that the indigenous painter was obscured is by saying that the original painting that gave way to this engraving was not really originated from this artist's genius, but from the inspiration of God and a patron who was inspired by the Virgin or God to write a description of the Virgin, and then he read this description to the indigenous painter, and the indigenous painter, through also a ritual, created a painting that was later transferred into this engraving. So in the Divinísima Corona, written by the patron does not acknowledge, does not even name the indigenous painter. And this is very common for minoritized communities. We're not really named, we're not really there. So Emily, through like analysis, pictographic analysis, compares, well, finds another painting. Can you please go to the next slide? And actually a set of paintings that are signed that show and reveal who the original painter was, an indigenous man, Mateo Mejia. And for example, she explains in the chapter how the face of the Virgin in this painting is very, very similar to the one in the engraving. And through a stylistic analysis, she shows like the coincidences, and she does conclude that Mateo Mejia was the author of the painting. And in this way, she says that indigenous art in Latin America was also original. It was not only like copies for engravings. In this case, it's the other way around. The provenance of the engraving was an original painter from an indigenous artist. And that would be my summary. Maya, I don't know, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful, Margarita. Susan Webster's work had previously alerted us to the work of Mateo Mejia, and then Emily, through her really archival and from Ecuador to Peru, this sleuthing about and also working in between mediums, of course, painting and engraving, she was able to figure out that indeed Mejia was the one that created the original, or was the inventor of the composition that then Diego de Figueroa, who was a goldsmith, but actually cut into a plate for the print that Margarita that we just saw. So really, really amazing art research, kind of detective work on Emily's part to find that, and to, you know, bring forth these artists' names. But I think going to Margarita, do you want to read the question that Nandi wrote?
Sure.
I want to give an answer to that then.
Emily, your chapter offers an extraordinary superlative example of a colonial Latin American print, in which you have been able to uncover the identity of the patron, inventor, and plate cutter. Through meticulous iconographical and textual analysis, your case study complicates narratives about artistic originality in the colonial Andes. Extrapolating from this example of Figueroa and Mejia's true portrait of the Virgin Mary, how might we differently approach comparable images for which we do not necessarily have the same information about the various hands that went into their production? Can this example help us devise different methodologies for researching engravings and the constellations of images to which they are connected?
Yeah, so I thought that was such a wonderful question. And this is such an amazing contribution from Emily Floyd in actually finding the names of these individuals and knowing that. But I think Emily's research, her dissertation on printmaking in Peru, really opened my eyes to the technical aspects of printmaking, and that is something that she had to know and understand before coming to this project. And I feel like when you're especially working across media, understanding the various steps involved in actually whether creating an oil painting, sourcing the materials, creating an oil painting, and then translating that to an engraved plate and creating a print, it is very useful to kind of pull that apart and look at all the interstices and the potential actors in between. Even if you don't know the names of those people, this is an activity that I actually kind of feel like I do in class sometimes with students, like what had to happen for this artwork to be here in front of us? And in that way, you can really come to recognize different abilities and techniques and, you know, human actions that needed to be taken, and thus recognize agency in the various people that would have needed to be involved in a particular product, especially like this, going from a painting to a print that's in a printed book, all of those people involved. And in that way, I mean, that was kind of the topic of our book, wanting to really understand artists in society. And even if we didn't have the names, you could still be talking about all of those things that needed to be happen, and different people within different kind of niches and different parts of the city and different parts of society that needed to work together. So I think that type of thing can be applied, even if you are not always finding the names of people.
Thank you, Maya.
Yes. So we are going next to Derek Burdett, and I actually have Emily's question for Derek. And Derek, you can answer that in due time. So Derek, your essay focuses on the role that artists played as expert witnesses who were called upon to examine purportedly miraculous artworks within the context of formal investigations in 17th century New Spain. Can you tell us more about these moments of expert testimony, which fall outside of what might ordinarily be considered artistic practice? Expert testimony. How do these moments add to our understanding of the role that artists played in elite colonial society?
Sure. Yeah. First, I want to apologize. We've had a lot of rain and big storms, and I think some trees came down near the house, and so did my internet. So I relocated to a coffee shop nearby, which is far less public. So I hope that far more public. So I hope that there's not too much ambient noise and that y'all can hear me. Can somebody tell? Yeah, you can. Okay. Great. So yeah, I was really interested in this project in sort of tugging on some archival threads that I'd come across in my work on miraculous statues, in which artists were called upon to examine the statues and provide testimony. Can we get the next slide, please? So by far the most prominent of these cases is associated with Miguel Cabrera in much later in 1751, when he examines the tilma, and then basically leverages that opportunity into a bunch of true portraits and his own publication, in which he kind of writes about the examination and the intersection of art and miraculous imagery. But I saw Miguel Cabrera's case as a kind of outlier, right? By sort of far and away, the majority of the artists who are called in
Some internet difficulties, but we are in Florida and it is a stormy day.
its materiality. And so I was really interested in sort of thinking about, okay, well, what can we make of these cases in which they occur? And I looked at the first examination of the Virgin of Guadalupe in 1666, and then an examination of the Señor de Ixmiquilpan in 1679. And then in 1731, a smaller case in which two artists are called upon to examine miraculous crucifix.
Maybe we can move to the next slide.
Social interactions between the artists and other members of elite society. Thank you for advancing the slides. Yeah. So here on the left, you can see an image of the Señor de Ixmiquilpan, a true portrait from later in the period, and on the right, one of the archival reports associated with these findings. So I wrote about the things that surprised me. First, that some things we expected, I should say. So first things we artists or Afro-Cuban artists, sort of subaltern artists. I'm writing about folks who are really at the center of a kind of political power in Mexico City. Second, that they leverage their kind of technical expertise and a deep knowledge about the materiality of art to make claims about what they could not identify. So the line that they were really searching for that distinguished between essentially fraud and divine action was the line in which their expertise ceased to be applicable. So what is it that they could not understand in the world? And I found that to be a really interesting dynamic in which their a successful miraculous artwork would produce a moment of ignorance on behalf of the experts. So I found that dynamic quite interesting. And I was interested also in writing about the ways in which these moments became performative for the artists. So I saw them as moments in which they would engage in essentially displaying their expertise for the other people in the room, whether they were members of the Cabildo Eclesiástico or lawyers, or sometimes the Archbishop and Viceroy themselves. So there was these moments in which artists were asked to perform their expertise, not by making an artwork, but by talking about how these artworks might have been made, or making aesthetic judgments about these artworks in the company of elite members of society. So I thought it was a kind of fascinating opportunity to look at three distinct sets of artists who are called upon, and then how did they handle that task? How does that show up in the archive? How can we try to read carefully these documents to make sense of the ways in which these moments of expert testimony might have provided opportunities to gain social capital for the people who were there. So yeah, so that was my experience with the project, and I hope that other people might find it as interesting or as useful as I found it. So yeah. Maya, should I go directly now to reading? I apologize, I missed the way that these transitions have been done. I'll just read directly the question for Margarita, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. So Margarita, your essay leverages the remarkable history of Angelina Martina, a Pochtecat, or a merchant from Tlatelolco, to shed new light onto the social and commercial aspects of the art world. One of the things that stands out the most in your essay is that you use this singular case study to suggest something larger about the ways that we have perhaps overlooked women's roles in 16th century New Spain because of our biases and our biased sources. Could you talk more about what you think the case of Angelina Martina shows us about female agency as it relates to the art and commercial world in the 16th century? And what lessons you think it might suggest for future scholarship on this subject and other related subjects?
Thank you, Derek. I think my presentation might answer the question, but I apologize if I'm repetitive. So the questions that drove my chapter were: the Tlatelolca women in Mexico City continue to have an important role in the city's economy, including the city's art world? What are the sources that we can use to study Indigenous women's history? And what are the biases to overcome when studying Indigenous women's history, including that of the Tlatelolca? To answer these questions, I analyzed the 1580 testament written by the Pochtecat Angelina Martina. The chapter includes an in-depth analysis of the testament and of its context, such as the role of women as principal merchants during pre-contact times, the continuity of Tlatelolca merchants' activity in Mexico City, the preeminence and bonanza that Tlatelolca women experienced in the 16th century, the significance of pre-contact art forms, such as featherwork and textiles, both in pre-contact and colonial times, and finally, the connection of the Pochteca or dealers to the art world. Next slide, please. So this is the first image of my chapter, and it is a diorama of Tlatelolco's market that I found in 2018 at the Museo de Sitio Tlatelolco del Centro Cultural Universitario. And that Centro Cultural, that museum, is next to what is left of the pyramids of Tlatelolco. And I found this diorama very, very striking because it really restricted the economic role of the Tlatelolca women in Tenochtitlan. The label to the diorama restricts Indigenous women's economic role to domestic and agricultural activities. And I'm going to read what the label said. The trades of women were those related to housekeeping. From a young age, they learned to prepare cacao, grind corn, cook, spin, and weave. They were in charge of the entire textile production, from common clothes to the ceremonial ones priests wore. Some women learned the trade of midwifery. In addition to counseling the future mother during their pregnancy, midwives knew which medicinal plants to use and which procedures to follow during birth. I mean, all of this is great, but the case of Angelina Martina suggests that they had more important roles than only those restricted to the women's world and the domestic arena. So one of the best sources to study Tlatelolco is the Florentine Codex. The figures that make up the diorama are taken from the Florentine Codex, but they were extracted from their original plate. This is a combination. This is a design. And by superimposing these designs taken from different plates of the Florentine Codex for aesthetic sake, the original content, which gives a more active role to women, is lost. And please look at the women in the center. I mean, by placing her right above plastic fruits and vegetables, her role is restricted, or she appears as a seller of produce. But in the original plate, please move to the next slide. She seems to have a much more active role. So she's sitting here in front of like common utensils like petates, which are reed mats, maybe molcajetes or some sort of ceramics, but also very elaborate textiles. And very elaborate textiles were made by elite women, and it was the Pochteca, the higher class of merchants who had access to them and who could bring them from the regions where cotton was produced. So this image here suggests like a much more expansive role for the woman that we previously saw only selling produce. And well, although written in colonial times, the Florentine Codex also shows bias. The text in Spanish restricts the role of women to the domestic arena, while the Nahuatl text is more inclusive. One example is the use of the term Pochtecasihuatl, Pochtecatl, which means merchant, Cihuatl means woman, and the description of the role of these women. Finally, the pictorial images present the participation of women in the market as extensive and diverse. The methodology I used to overcome the bias to women's studies is interdisciplinary. Philological analysis, textual analysis, image analysis, archival research, and even the use of archaeological models. And I do hope that this brief overview invites you to read the chapter. Derek, I think I'm answering a lot of your questions, but maybe what I can do is like explain some things. So in Mexico, and I'm Mexican, I went to school at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. In Mexico, we only have the Spanish translation. Like, to my knowledge, and Barbara, please correct me if I'm wrong. What you can find in a bookstore, what students can buy, is the most common one is the Porrúa edition of Sahagún, and that is only in Spanish. It does not include the Nahuatl text, and it doesn't include images. Right now, you can have access to the images online, but that was not true until very recently. So the impact of that in Mexico is that they are not seeing these two other sources unless they have the money to like access them. Or now, yes, it's different because it's in the internet, but not before. So I think that that has impacted, in addition to, of course, a very patriarchal and macho culture, that has impacted and created a great bias against the study of women. So when I first presented this idea of a Pochtecatl, a woman from Tlatelolco who was a Pochtecatl at the UNAM, it was not well received. They did tell me, no, you're wrong. Women's activity was just restricted to surplus of their domestic production. This cannot be possible. But then I explained the sources, and it was a bit better received. But so I think that the greatest challenge, frankly, to expand the source is bias. But there are other challenges. For example, the sources were written by men, Spanish and indigenous. The sources were written in the colonial era, thus their framework is European. So we do need to think, when we assume that this is pre-contact, is it really? These sources show at the same time, so they're contradictory, because at the same time they show that there was a hierarchical system in the Mexica world in which Mexica women were subordinated to men, but at the same time they show the existence of a system of dualism and complementarity. And again, above everything, the bias, because even though the words might be there, even in the Spanish version, you can see the description of women as principal merchants, but even when it's there, it's not acknowledged. So I think that the first thing to study women in a fairer way is to overcome the bias. And then going back to what Barbara said at the beginning is to question the archive, to read against the grain in the archive. And I think Lisa Sosa has written extensively about this. To find the stories that are in the traditional archive about women and analyze them further using different tools, such as the projects that the digital projects that we're discussing here. And okay, I guess that's it. And now I'm going to read my question to Jennifer. Jen, I really enjoyed your analysis of the Florentine Codex, the Badianus Herbal, and the Uppsala map, and the way you expanded the concept of artist to include teachers, merchants, cartographers, and even doctors. Your chapter is the only one that deals with the relationship between a formal institution, the Colegio de Santa Cruz, and the production of art in the early viceroyalty. Can you discuss the impact of an institutional approach to the conception of art in colonial Latin America?
Yes, thank you for your question, Margarita. Thank you, Maya, Margarita, Ala, and University of Florida Press. So I think similar to you, Margarita, in my summary of my essay, I think I hope to answer your question. So I've been researching the Colegio de Santa Cruz and its artistic productions for a long time, and the slide that you're looking at has the Colegio enlarged on the Uppsala map on your right. And for those of you who might not be familiar, the Colegio de Santa Cruz was the first institution of higher education established by Franciscan friars for Nahua youths and opened in 1536. And what drew me to the institution are what some scholars have argued are the syncretic origins of the institution. So we know it was based on a early modern Franciscan seminary model of curriculum and education, but some have pointed towards the text in the Florentine Codex to argue that it also mirrors aspects of the Calmecac, which is the Mexica educational institution for youths. And so I take this as a starting point in my essay to look at the ways that these origins might have helped facilitate a transformation in the conceptual scope of what it means to be an artist in early colonial Mexico Tenochtitlan. And so, as Margarita mentioned, I use the Florentine Codex, the Badianes Herbal, and the Uppsala map of Mexico Tenochtitlan as case studies to explore who might have been involved in artistic production at this site and what it meant for the social status of the participants. And so here's where I will answer Margarita's question about the impact of an institutional approach, which I love because I don't think I thought of it that way per se as explicitly as my methodological approach, but now I wonder how it might be applied elsewhere for other case studies. But I think the benefit in this case is that much ink has been spilled on the Florentine Codex, but for the Badianes Herbal and certainly the Uppsala map, there's a considerable lack of documentation regarding the circumstances of their production. Particularly for the Uppsala map, there's no record of its commission, the names of its artists, or even its receipt or existence once it reaches Europe. And so by ascertaining a site, at least, I think it allowed me or provided me some basic parameters in which I could start to triangulate how objects might have been made and who would have participated in their creation. And in a way, allowed me to use the visual documents as primary sources in the absence of these ancillary textual records. And so I'll recap my findings in the time that remains. So similarly to Margarita, I take a philological analysis, linguistic analysis of text from book 10 to see how those involved in art making are described in Nahuatl. And so this is building on the work of Elizabeth Boone and Jeanette Favreau-Peterson, who talk about the Tlamatinime or the sages, but then also looking at other descriptions. I highlight how physicians and healers are also discussed, I think, in practices around art making. And so then as my second case study, I talk about how the Badianes Herbal is this excellent attestation to that, where it seems that Nahua healers, their expertise was very, thank you for the next slide. So this is an image of the text from book 10 that describes the Tlaquilo, but I kind of mine it for other references to other practitioners. And then the Badianes Herbal on the right. And then the third case study, if you could go to the next slide, is the Uppsala map. And I talk about here how the Uppsala map demonstrates the input of somebody with extensive geographic knowledge, such as the Pochtecat. So again, kind of echoing Margarita's research, semi-elite merchants that may have likely been involved in the creation of this very geographically extensive map of the region. And so collectively, what I argue is that these documents demonstrate the inherently collaborative nature of artistic production at the Colegio, both manually with the input of several artistic hands, as you can see in my slide on the right, these details of the Uppsala map, but also the input of multiple types of expertise, from healers to scribes to merchants. And I conclude with a discussion of how the Colegio not only expanded the conceptual scope of art making, but also facilitated opportunities of upward social mobility through the social capital that its students, its faculty, and graduates gained through their time there. So that's a summary of my chapter, and I will transition to Maya. I have a question for Maya. So Maya, in your chapter, you take a comparative transatlantic and transcontinental approach to analyze the socio-political context of what it meant to be an artist in early modern Spain and viceregal New Spain and Peru. And you offer these incredibly invaluable insights on how artists advocated for their rights and agency through collective organization. So I found this to be incredibly enlightening and an approach that's not often taken, especially in comparison to my study, which is very kind of a micro-history, locally focused case study. So my question is, I was wondering if throughout this research, you thought of other ways that this particular methodology could be applied in our discussion and consideration of the artist in colonial Latin America. Are there other areas or topics in terms of the social context of artistic practice that might benefit from this particular type of comparative analysis?
Thank you, Jennifer. So I think I'll be able to answer your question kind of near the beginning of my brief, a brief summary of what I do in my chapter. And by the way, this is the last chapter that we're covering. It's the first chapter after the introduction in the book, and so thanks everyone for sticking with us. So I challenged myself for this chapter in doing a comparative approach. It's something that I've wanted to do in prior research and hadn't been able to do it adequately, I don't think. And actually I was spurred to do it because the material that gave me the idea for this, for looking at artists' rights specifically, were some scattered archival references from Peru. I realized I didn't really have enough, and so I needed to look more broadly. So in some ways, if you don't have enough for one area you're studying, but you can narrow down your topic, take it comparatively, that is kind of something that is methodologically fruitful. So that and that's one way it's useful, but I think can be deeper, much more important in other ways. So then getting into the topic, I was thinking generally about human rights and how artists as professionals in society had rights, what kind of rights they were given. And specifically, I needed to look at artists, whether painters or weavers, within the framework of as crafts people, craft professionals. So peoples that in a European sense would have been working within guilds. Also, largely kind of because of that lack of information, but it enabled me to understand why artists did certain things or were classed in certain ways because they were seen as artisans. So really, for a long time, it was like, is the word artist even right here? It really should be artisan most of the time. So I did expand outward and looked at the rights given to craftspeople in Europe and specifically Spain in the 16th century and prior centuries. And then I looked at some especially rich examples and archival examples from Mexico. We can go to the next slide, I think. Yeah, and I'll get to that. From Mexico, and then coupled those with the things that I had already found for Peru to kind of put those together. But I think the comparative approach, looking at things going on in Spain and even across viceroyalties, can really be useful. First of all, it allows you to complicate, problematize maybe the mistaken impression that we had that there was a monolithic Spanish way of doing things that came over to the Americas. That certainly was, things were different in different parts of Spain, and things were applied, and there were different ideas about things in different parts of the Americas. Then just seeing the ways that say the structure of craft professions were built in early colonial society in different places really allows you to see differences between them that allow you to see agency in ways and you know, with difference comes human activity and human discernment, things like that really do allow for us to see kind of the lives of artists and the ways that the things that they were able to do and not able to do, also to call out the limitations that artists had to face in whatever time period, but especially in the 16th century. So broadly, this chapter is about the ways in which artists advocated for their rights as craftspeople through the 16th century. In the beginning, they simply had to advocate or had to struggle to not be enslaved. Then they had to struggle to not provide obligatory personal service. By 1560, something that is wonderfully outlined in this document that I looked at and was really a centerpiece of the chapter, this Anahuat Análisis de Juan Bautista, by 1560 in Mexico City in particular, a very kind of central place for this type of advocacy towards human rights. In around 1560, artists were able to do two things that were really crucial and probably had, you know, far-reaching impact for centuries. Indigenous artists, they were able to advocate for not being required to do so-called personal service, servicio personal, which would mean service to Spanish officials, to church officials, and to Native leaders, doing things like bringing forage for horses or doing masonry for buildings, things like that, which under the way that Indigenous people were classed and treated under the colonial system, they generally could be called on, forced to do this personal service. Artists advocated to be freed from that personal service, and then also to not have to do their art as a form of labor tribute. They advocated to be paid in money for their artistic activities, their professional activities, which wasn't the case at that time. And then the one thing they could not advocate for was to be completely freed from monetary tribute. That was the major thing that was not in play, that was not a point of negotiation at that point. And as we know, it was never at that point through the colonial period. But they were able to advocate to be paid for their work in money and then use that money to pay their tribute. So you see artists kind of advocating for really personal things like their livelihoods and then being able to exert their work in their professional abilities to fulfill colonial obligations, but also be professionals in society. The Análisis really outlines the specific negotiations that took place in 1560 and how the artists really stood strong to demand those two things. And they were also in the community with other craftspeople, I think especially shoemakers and someone else, if I remember the other, all of the other craftspeople that were there. Next slide, please. These are those artists who are represented and named often in the Análisis, were a unique artistic milieu in San Juan Moyatlan, part of Tenochtitlan of Mexico City. They included Marcos Zipac de Aquino, who is thought to have been the painter of the original Virgin of Guadalupe painting. And next slide, please. And probably the artist who created this pictorial manuscript that also enumerates events in the 1560s, the Xiuhpohualli of Tenochtitlan Codex. Here we have textual references, but also pictographic references to the events that I just touched on briefly and I explain in the chapter. But it's very, very poignant illustration, because if you see at the top right, the column of pictographs underneath the top image is a little image of a house. And next to that in the text, that's one of the few first person references in this manuscript. The artist says, in that year, I was able to build my little house. And below that is actually a version of the account of the protests that were happening around Tribute at the time. That's, you have stones illustrated there. People stoned the house, one of the houses of the officials. And then not only that, but the very bottom, you see a kind of yellow grid at the very bottom. That's actually an altarpiece that the same artists were working on at the same time as they were advocating for their rights to be freed from personal service and to be paid money for their work. So as much as they're creating artworks, their artistic livelihoods were in play at the time, and they're really standing up for them. So I go over other cases in which artists in Peru especially advocated for things like making clear contracts for their works. They advocated for being able to be mobile between cities in order to sell their artworks, and lots of things. So for me, it was really interesting to look into the history of human rights in the 16th century, and how I argued that perhaps artists really were key kind of motives for some of the actual more universal human rights that came up at the time, and especially indigenous rights, which now are well respected, but it was somewhat respected, but was not something that was recognized at that time. But we see the seeds of it in the 16th century with artists as activists. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm going to turn it over to Joanna to have a Q&A.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joanna Reyes, and I'm the Secretary Treasurer of ALA, the somewhat new Secretary Treasurer. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and for hanging on until the end. This book presentation was really wonderful, and I'm just reminded how important it is for us to gather in community like this and to celebrate the achievements of each other with each other. So thank you all again for being here. I just want to commend the authors and editors of this book. You've created something that's really remarkable, this collection of scholarship that's timely and thought-provoking, and it opens so many doors and new pathways in our field. And thanks again for the publishers for joining us as well, and for extending this generous discount to ALA members. So without further ado, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. And attendees, if you would like to, you can just enter questions into the Q&A box. And maybe while people are working on that, I can just ask a question of you guys. I'm wondering if any of you were surprised by maybe unexpected overlaps or themes that have arisen out of your work. I know, of course, you have kind of a guiding principle when you started the book. And I was thinking, as Barbara was speaking about the conclusion, that this idea of, well, if we want to broaden the idea of who's an artist, we have to think about broadening the idea of what art is itself. So I was thinking kind of along those lines, if there were any overlaps or unexpected convergences for you.
I'll take that if I'm audible. I couldn't tell how bad I was. Okay. The last thing we need to do is just subject us to internet cutout garble for 30 seconds. So so in the process, one of the ways in which we were made aware of those kind of intersections, right, was when Maya and Margarita were reading all of our essays and saying, okay, you read this, you read that, you read this. And I really loved to sort of the connections that emerged between my article and Linda's article, which are both articles that address the sort of role of expertise around materiality in the sort of mid to late colonial period, and fears and concerns and doubts. And so the doubts in her case study were like, wait, might you be selling poison to people who are interested in poisoning white folks? And the doubts in my essays were like, wait, might this painting have been made by, or might this statue have been miraculously renovated or duplicitously repainted by somebody looking for profits? And so doubts were of a very different nature, but yet we see in both cases the concerns being rooted around this question of like a really concrete knowledge about the materials and what they're capable of and what they're not capable of, and how that expertise then gets enmeshed in these strange court cases, essentially. One, in my case, in these informaciones jurídicas, these like more ecclesiastical court documents, right, as opposed to in her case a secular court, like the investigations. But I thought those overlappings in the middle of the Venn diagram were kind of lovely and unexpected to me. So that was one particular instance. It isn't a larger assessment of sort of, oh, across the board these things, but just the sort of lovely connections that emerge when people's research kind of bumps up against one another.
Thank you.
I also wanted to raise how nicely the different articles treated the question of artistic subjectivities, particularly when they're subaltern subjectivities. And one place that Derek goes, and actually Emily's essay goes as well, is the ways that, we usually think of Spanish or Creole subjectivities as artists as being a kind of set thing with parameters. But what I really liked was how those two essays put them into play in a dynamic relation with subaltern subjectivities. So I thought that was a really kind of a novel world. It didn't look at just, indigenous people or Afro-descendant people as existing in their own kind of like subjective universe, and Creoles and Spaniards existing somewhere else. But it actually understood that these are dynamic and mutually constitutive. So that was really kind of nice, a nice kind of takeaway from the volumes for me.
I think what comes up all the time looking at these chapters, especially as we thought about how race was being represented, how people, how they were enabled to act as subjects, is that always in all cases, it's something that feels like it's in the process of formation. And there's nothing already set. And I think, I don't know, I think there's somehow a great value in that. And it's not, Aaron had suggested, for us to use, and I know he's used in his earlier publications, the term kind of proto-racist ideologies, or, because these things were definitely under discussion and seen in different ways in different places. And then you have, historical changes that spur reevaluations and say indigenous artists who are extremely talented and become so very recognized, so that they have the effect of changing the way that people are looking at indigenous artists, I think. So I think that just generally lets us, we have maybe a sense of this kind of Spanish colonies as a sad period of 300-year period, at least outside people, we don't, but period in which it was very repressive and kind of things, not that many things happened, but certainly things were under negotiation all the time.
If I may add something very briefly, for me, the coincidence that caught my attention was the importance of ritual, because Emily talks about how the patron did not want the painter to start painting until the patron had said a prayer and until he got to a specific line. So they were praying, they were having this ritual, and then the painting took place. And Derek also discusses like the ritual that these people had to follow to prove that they were the specialists and that they were doing the incredible thing of deciphering whether this is a miraculous art or fake. So that caught my attention. And perhaps even though it's not a ritual, Nandi talks about the actions, violent actions against art. So it's like this activity that is not creating art per se, but somehow it's adjacent to the production of art. That caught my attention.
Yeah, things that we might think of as performative writ large, right? So like if we expand ritual into this question of the performative, it might be more capacious and make space for a lot of those different things. Certainly, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. I think that's a good note for us to end on. Again, I want to just thank everyone for attending. And again, thank you to the authors for really adding some color and texture into a time period, as Maya noted, that, you know, is oftentimes sort of not recognized for the real kind of variety and the sort of like webs of communication and things that are happening. So thanks again. And yeah, I don't know if Maya or Margarita wanted to say anything in closing or.
We just wanted to thank you, Joanna, and thank Ala and UPF and all of you, dear authors, for being with us, and Paul, dear reviewer, for helping us so much with this project. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye. Thank
Thanks,
you.
you too.